You may not know this, but in 1983, the world, as we have known it, almost came to an end. It was in 1983 that Ronald Reagan was calling the Soviet Union that evil empire. The U.S. had invaded the island of Grenada. The military had introduced a ballistic missile defense system that would become known as Star Wars. Meanwhile, Great Britain and France that year implemented their own nuclear weapons program. And the Soviet Union conducted more than a half dozen underground nuclear test explosions, all while massing troops on the border of Poland, because a movement called Solidarity was causing ripples in the Iron Curtain. It was also in 1983, September 1st, 1983, that the USSR shot down Korea Air Flight 007, killing all 269 people on board, including Georgia Congressman Larry McDonald. I was just a boy, but I remember the tension so well, especially given that Georgia congressman perished. And growing up in Georgia, it was all over the news for days. It was as close to all-out war as the U.S. and the USSR had come since the Cuban Missile Crisis, as close as we have ever come to war and destruction for the world, but that's not even the half of it. 3 weeks after Flight 007 was shot down, with nerves on edge, with thousands of nuclear warheads aimed at each other, one of the greatest heroes of our time quietly went to work at a Soviet military base just outside of Moscow. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. And until a decade or so ago, no one knew his name or about his heroics. It was Petrov's duty to monitor the early alert system to warn the Soviet Union if there was ever a nuclear missile attack by the United States. In such a strike, the Soviet Union's protocol was to launch an immediate all-out nuclear response. And so it was that on September 26, 1983, the unthinkable happened. At Colonel Petrov's station, suddenly the computer alarms sounded, warning that an American missile was headed toward Moscow. Petrov waited. He reasoned that it had to be a computer error, since the United States was not likely to launch just one missile if they were attacking the Soviet Union. But then a second missile was detected, and then a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth. The sky seemed to be filled with ballistic warheads. Everyone in the station expected the worst, and Petrov made his decision. He declared it a false alarm. He could not believe that the U.S. would attack. And further, it was unthinkable for him that he would be the final reason for a war that would end human civilization. Seconds passed, minutes, then an hour. There were no missiles. The colonel had been correct. The warning system, the most advanced technological system of its day, had malfunctioned. And by recognizing this, Stanislav Petrov likely saved the lives of billions of people. It's a common deep thought exercise. Can one person actually make a difference in the world? Can they really? Well, Petrov certainly did. And most of the world has never even heard of him. What about Dr. David Nayland? Have you ever heard of him? Any hands? In 1968, he was fresh out of medical school, working in Bangladesh, treating cholera patients. He started giving his patients 1 liter of water with a teaspoon of salt and 8 teaspoons of sugar. It was a hydration breakthrough as effective as a feeding tube or an IV and insanely inexpensive. UNICEF would say 20 years later, no other single medical breakthrough of the 20th century has had the potential to prevent so many deaths over such a short period of time and at so little cost. David Nayland is responsible for saving the lives of 50 million people over the last half century. Have you ever heard of Henrietta Lacks? She went to Johns Hopkins Hospital with pelvic pain, 1951. One of just a few hospitals at the time that would treat a poor African American woman. She had cancer, a cancer that would take her life in the following weeks. But while she was being treated, Johns Hopkins doctors took a biopsy and discovered that her cells are some of the most amazing cells that they have ever seen. In the right conditions, her cells reproduce and double every 24 hours. The HeLa line, as they are now called, were used to develop the polio vaccine. They were used to create new cancer drugs to cure leukemia, treat AIDS patients, and they are now a central part of COVID and flu treatments. They have been taken to space, shipped to doctors all over the world, and have 11,000 different patents and medicinal applications, and she alone has saved 10 million lives. Carl Bosch, he invented the process to put nitrogen back into depleted topsoil. His discovery has saved 2 billion people from starvation. Rachel Sneerson, Mason Sones, Niels Bohin, Pearl Kendrick, David Cushman, Anne Holloway, Leslie Collier. Do you know any of these people? You probably don't, but many of us are alive today. Millions upon millions of us are alive, or we are living longer fulfilling lives because these people, whose names are largely unknown, contributed to the world their intellect, their insight, covering everything from medical breakthroughs to the 3-point seatbelt. Of course, one person can change the world. One person can save countless lives, can save your life, even though you may have never heard of them and even though you could not pick them out of a lineup if you had to. One more name for you this morning. Reinhold Niebuhr. By a show of hands, how many of you know who this man is? 3 or 4 people. That's about customary when you speak of him to a group. Reinhold Niebuhr's father, Gustav, came to the United States from Germany in 1881 as a teenager. Gustav became a brilliant young man on the American frontier, traveling with other German families into the Midwest, where he became a pastor in what would eventually become the United Church of Christ. 3 of Gustav's children would follow in his footsteps. Hulda, the daughter, became a seminary teacher and theologian, one of the first women in this country to ever break that glass ceiling. Richard, the youngest, also became a theologian, a best-selling author, and probably the greatest ethicist of the 20th century. And then there was Reinhold, the youngest. What an incredible family this was. And Reinhold was destined to become the most influential. He took up his father's line of work. He entered the ministry, and school was very difficult for him, more difficult for him than his siblings. But by grit more than brains, he got accepted at Yale Divinity School, but found his 2 years there very difficult. First, he was a Midwesterner, more comfortable on a farm than in the city. And because his native language was German, that's all that was ever spoken of in home and not English. So as soon as he finished his master's degree, he left and took his first pastorate, the Bethel Evangelical Church in Detroit, Michigan. The church had 65 members, even fewer attendees when he arrived. But this was Detroit in 1915, Henry Ford's Detroit. And the Midwestern German farm boy took on Henry Ford. He publicly pointed out that Ford was an anti-Semite, that he was a racist. And he said that for all the good Mr. Ford did in the city and in the country, his treatment of his workers was unchristian, unethical, and downright crooked. Because working people who have rich bosses ought to be treated better. Quoting, speaking of Henry Ford, "In our day of enlightenment, it is possible for a man to amass billions of dollars and be praised for the astuteness of his business impulses, even though the groans of his workers may be heard above the din of his machines. Look at the industrial enterprise anywhere, and you will find criminal indifference on the part of the strong to the fate of the weak. The lust for power and the greed for gain are the dominant notes in business. The man of power is a beast of prey, brutal and immoral, who even when he is generous only to expend more power over others. Bethel Evangelical Church in Detroit, Michigan exploded with growth as Reinhold Niebuhr offered a vision of living the Christian life that was neither escapist nor utopian. It wasn't naive, it wasn't sentimental. Christian faith, he said, had to work. It had to be practical. It had to be meaningful in the here and the now, not just the there and the then. It was what he called Christian realism. If it wasn't real for real people in the real world, it was salt that had lost its saltiness and it should be discarded. It was a light hidden under a bushel that could provide no guidance or warmth to the world. And this vision and this courage convinced Union Seminary to hire Niebuhr as professor of ethics in 1928, where he would remain until his death in 1971. A generation after his death, Time magazine wrote an article in his memory in 2005. In part, it reads this: he attended 2 second-rate church schools, a boarding academy, and a seminary. Raised in a German-speaking home, he entered Yale Divinity School in 1913, struggling to speak English. When he joined the faculty of New York City's Union Theological Seminary in 1928, the old guard grumbled because this novice with a Midwest twang had no doctorate degree. He raised eyebrows when he wore a rumpled suit to a tuxedos-only reception and was constantly pouring hollandaise over his entire meal instead of properly dipping into it as he should have. He was uncouth, a country bumpkin with decidedly dubious scholarly credentials, but he became the nation's theologian and a fiery preacher. He would strut, gyrate, jerk bend, and quake in the pulpit. No one's ever described me that way, but that's pretty good. But his greatest contribution, his greatest legacy, is a prayer that he penned in 1932. The most well-known prayer in North America outside of the Lord's Prayer that we heard read from today. And it is Niebuhrian to its core, gutsy, real, practical, and it has given solace and determination to millions of people over the decades, literally saving thousands of people's lives, and it sustains now more than 118,000 individual groups in more than 180 countries. The prayer begins like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Yes, that's the opening lines of what is now known as the Serenity Prayer, used by AA and recovery groups far and wide, inscribed onto thousands of sobriety chips, and maybe the greatest single slice of North American spirituality ever produced. The prayer first came to be used by Alcoholics Anonymous groups in New York City in 1941, though at the time the prayer's author was unknown to that group. It was discovered, just printed in an obituary in the New York Times, and someone who attended an AA meeting really loved it. And they brought it into AA, and Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, when he read the prayer for the first time, said this, quote, "Never have I seen so much of AA communicated in so few words. The Serenity Prayer will be the cornerstone of what we build." And with that, the prayer began appearing in recovery communities, in books, on business cards, on posters, shared at meetings. It captured perfectly the very way forward for those trying to put their lives together. Only after it became popular did people go looking for who wrote it. Some people said, oh, it came from St. Francis. Some said, no, it's from the Greeks, straight from Aristotle. Another one said it's an Irish poet. Someone else said, no, it's a World War I military officer. Someone else had evidence that it was from St. Thomas Aquinas. One AA member claimed it was Sanskrit, Augustine, Spinoza, St. Patrick, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Persian magi, Japanese haiku, Teutonic knights from the Middle Ages. Everybody had a theory about where this magnificent piece of wisdom originated. And then Henry S., and that's all we know, we don't know his last name, Henry S. decided that he would write, but because he had heard the rumor that Reinhold Niebuhr had authored this prayer, and so he wrote the professor and inquired. Thus, a decade after using the prayer, A.A. discovered its author. Niebuhr, shocked that his words were being used far and wide, wrote Henry S. back and said this: I wrote that prayer in 1932 as part of a sermon I gave in New England. 2 years later, my friend Dr. Howard Robbins asked if he could include it in a book of prayers he was putting together. I gave him permission, and afterwards the prayer was given to many soldiers by the USO during World War II. Of course, there's nothing new in this prayer, he said. It's been spooking around for years, even centuries. I just captured it. And while my original wording is somewhat different than how your group has printed it, I don't mind. In some respects, I believe the way you say the prayer is even better than the original. Reinhold Niebuhr's name is rarely, if ever, attached to one of the greatest prayers ever written in the English language. He certainly didn't copyright it, and neither did he nor any of his descendants benefit financially from its prolific use then or now. Namelessly, facelessly, unselfishly, anonymously, He gave the world something as old as eternity and as new as tomorrow. He gave us the wisdom of the ages. He gave us a summary of every and all genuine spiritual paths. He gave us a short, profound spiritual mantra, a shibboleth, whereby we can look deep within ourselves, we can face the world for how it is, and then we can find the greatest power of all, the power to surrender to the will of God. The entire Serenity Prayer is longer than this, and it reads as such. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking, as Christ did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that Christ will make all things right if I surrender to His will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with Him forever in the next. Amen. In the weeks to come, we will take this prayer line by line. We will celebrate it, this good deed that shines out for all of us to see. And we will learn from it, I hope, how to live lives of strength and peace in a mad, mad world that cannot, that never could, and never will provide us the peace and strength that we need. So let us breathe deep. Let us dive even deeper and discover the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things that we can, and the wisdom to know the difference.